Yeah, I'm a recovering ambassador at the moment, an ex-excellency. And before being an ambassador, I worked for the last paper and pen Prime Minister, Tony Blair. He used to write to us in longhand. Then the first email Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, he used to send us emails in capital letters giving us our instructions, normally at 3 o'clock in the morning. And then for the first iPad Prime Minister, David Cameron. So in just 4 years in Downing Street, I saw the way that technology was already changing the interface between leaders and populations. And when I left Downing Street, I was worried because we were trying to define policy in terms of the sky ticker, the soundbite that runs along the bottom of the screen. By the time I got to Beirut 4 years ago, I realized that often we were trying to define policy in something even shorter, 140 characters. I thought what it might be worth doing today is just give you a few reflections on what I learned really about power, first and foremost, when I was in Lebanon, and through this process of becoming more engaged on social media. And then a sense of what I think that means now for my craft of diplomacy. We still think of it as a craft. And in particular, whether we are going to survive as diplomats the digital age, or whether we are facing our own Kodak moment. So firstly, power. And as you said, I've been writing this book on the future of power. I think the first thing is to note that, and it will be very obvious this already to all of you I know, that we really are going through the fastest period of change in history. It sounds a glib thing to say, but it is an extraordinary moment to be alive. And the sociologists tell us that in the next century, we'll go through the equivalent in change in society that we went through in the last 43 centuries. Very specifically, 43 centuries, which is the equivalent of going from the cave painting to the atom bomb in 100 years. And that change is evidently going to put not just many businesses out of business, more Kodaks. It is going to put many ideas out of business and many states out of business. And that's in particular where that wave of disruption that you'll know much more about than me meets then my industry. Not only are we being disrupted like everyone else, but we as diplomats are going to find ourselves trying to deal with the consequences of all that disruption. Because there will, of course, be big winners and big losers. And at previous times of transition like that, we have tended to fall back into conflict. One of our jobs as diplomats will be trying to manage that, help to manage all that change without falling back into times of greater peril again. Second thing about power, and again, I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but it's a message I keep having to give to my colleagues. All this digital technology is on balance shaping our lives for the better. It terrifies us, and it terrifies many people in my world. But it's very, very good for a trade like diplomacy. 2015 was the most peaceful year since records began. Now, it doesn't feel like that if you're watching Sky News or if you live in Gaza or Syria or Yemen. But my children have 0.5% as much chance of dying violently as my grandparents. So despite all that massive pain, there is also some massive gain as well. Third point on power. Power is becoming much easier to get. Look at the result from New Hampshire yesterday. Trump and Saunders coming through. People are coming up much, much faster. It is very possible that the next British Prime Minister is not even in politics yet. People are coming up fast. But when you get the power, and I'm sure that everyone from Obama to David Cameron would agree with this, it's much, much harder to use than you expect. I always imagined when I was working in Downing Street that eventually you'd get to a small room at the centre of government where you were able to pull the levers of power. And I got closer and closer and closer in until I realised I was the only person left in the room, and I certainly didn't feel I had any power. Governments increasingly feel very frustrated at the real limits on their authority and power. And that power, when you get it, it's not just harder to use, but it's also then easier to lose. You can rise up fast, but then you fall very fast as well. And you can look at, say, 3 years ago, if you'd asked me to predict who the 20 most powerful people in British politics would be, at least 10 of them now are no longer in British politics. So you lose power much faster as well. But one trend that is very clear amid all this flux is that the world in which diplomats and diplomacy is most comfortable, a world of maps and chaps, is being rapidly eroded. We derive our power as diplomats from very traditional sources of authority, very traditional institutions. We're attached to the monarchy, we're attached to the British state, for example. And all of those sources of authority are under attack. We are not necessarily actively being disrupted ourselves as diplomats, but those sources of authority are. And diplomacy is, of course, Darwinian. And so if we fail to adapt that competition, if we fail to adjust to this new context, then we will find ourselves in rapid decline. Before jumping forward, two stories from the past. One, the world's first ever diplomat, let's call him Ugg, would have been the first prehistoric man to persuade the prehistoric man next to him to stop clubbing him over the head for long enough that they could go out and hunt together. So we have these two strong instincts as humans, one to fight for resource and kill for resource, and one to collaborate for resource. And all through history, the diplomats have been trying to find ways to collaborate for resource. And when you strip away the paraphernalia that we've put around our profession, protocol and conferences and titles, platitudinous statements and so on, we're still doing what that prehistoric man was doing, trying to be the lubricant in the machine as these ideas and businesses and states rub up against each other, trying to find ways to help people to cooperate. We're not so far from Ugg as you might think. Jump forward several thousand years, maybe tens of thousands of years, 6th century BC, one of the first diplomats who we might recognize as more like the diplomats of today. In Chinese in the Qin dynasty, an ambassador called Shen. And his job was to go and negotiate the treaties after the wars which his emperor was waging across the region. He had a very cushy job because basically his emperor was pretty ruthless. He would tend to kill half the people he defeated and bury the other half up their necks in sand. So it's fairly easy to negotiate a treaty with a bunch of people buried up their necks in sand. So this guy, pretty cushy life. Nice job, the pleasures of the royal court, and imposing peace treaties on defeated enemies. But on his way to make peace after one of these conflicts, he made his usual journey, 5 days by horse getting progressively more tired, without realizing that his opponents in the negotiation had developed a new form of travel, whereby they rested their horses at points along the journey, which meant they got there 2 days earlier because the horses were rested. But also that they had 2 days of extra information, we would now call it intelligence, on what his position would be. As a result, they held out for a better deal than they would have got otherwise. So poor old Shen gallops back on his horse, presumably getting even more tired, to his capital. And his emperor, as you have worked out, is not a very merciful type. And so had him slow sliced, death by 1,000 cuts. We only know about this because it's recorded in Chinese diplomatic history as the first example of a human rights case. It angered many people enough that it became a cause for an early human rights lobby. But of course the message for me and for modern diplomats is an obvious one, that if you fail to adapt to new communications technology, then you're finished. Hopefully not death by 1,000 cuts, hopefully not slow sliced. We tend to be a bit gentler with our poor performers now. But nevertheless, you are out of business. So I think the real challenge for the 21st century is where we see these dividing lines as this power shifts. The dividing lines between libertarians and control freaks, between transparency and privacy or secrecy, as we like to look at it as diplomats, between old and new power, and between global and national interest. And in all those cases, I believe diplomats still have a role in helping society to get through those big, difficult, dividing issues. But nowhere is it more important than the oldest issue in the book, going right back again to our caveman, Ugg, our prehistoric man. Because it's the issue for the 21st century, the big dividing line for the 21st century is the same as it was for him. Do we live together? Do we coexist across religions, societies, nations? Or do we live apart? And there are many people on the other side of the argument, not just the sort of box office barbarians of ISIL, but a fair few US presidential candidates, for example, and a fair few people in our own politics closer to home who might still feel that the answer to the 21st century is just to build a bigger wall. So I'd say our influence as diplomats in the digital age matters more than ever, but it is under attack and it's in decline. Why is it in decline? First reason is austerity. It's much harder to have an outward-looking, pioneering mindset when your economies are shrinking. An obvious point. This isn't just about the funding that ministries of foreign affairs get. It's also about that outward-looking trading mindset that successful societies need. I think we're in decline, and I hope this is a tactical point, as a consequence of recent military interventions, and in particular Iraq, which has eroded public confidence in authority and in diplomacy. I think we're in decline because of the fragility, the weakness of the international system. Those institutions that were constructed after the Second World War, the Bretton Woods institutions, the United Nations, are proving not yet well equipped for the digital age, for the 21st century. I think we're in decline because of a failure to adapt, like many industries that are built around hierarchy and traditional sources of authority. We're probably in decline as well because of the shift in power between East and West, and so that the Western concept of a more interventionist, peacemaking, negotiating style of diplomacy is being replaced by a more Eastern concept, which is prioritizing national interests, trade, and more of the soft power end of diplomacy. We're struggling also because, as I said, states themselves are losing power, and so those of us who work for states are losing power. But I think a really fundamental point is that all of this empowerment which new digital tools gives to people, a very, very good thing, of course, a very, very good thing for diplomacy, because every time you have more democratic oversight of foreign policy, it gets better. We go to war less often. We become more peaceful. But it does make diplomacy much, much harder. To give you two examples, it makes it much harder to play diplomatic poker with someone like Putin, for example, because you can't bluff. He's seen your cards already, because you've already had to explain to the media or your parliament or the people you're engaging with online what your position will be. Think too of the European negotiations that David Cameron is in now. Pretty much everyone in Europe knows what his negotiating position is before he starts. Makes it much, much harder to negotiate. Another one from my recent experience would be the Syria crisis in August 2013. The red line set on bombing Assad because of his use of chemical weapons was a red line that we then couldn't back up because the public, perhaps rightly, we can debate that, felt that this was not something we should be doing. So again, it's much harder for diplomats and leaders to have that leeway that makes diplomacy easier. Now, I would always be evangelical about more oversight, more transparency, more openness around diplomacy. But we need to recognize too that it makes it harder for the people doing the diplomacy. So, facing this disruption, facing this new concept, diplomacy has to change. I think fundamentally the who of diplomacy is shifting. We are going to have to build new coalitions, new campaign models that bring in civil society, businesses, individual citizens, and not just governments into the work of diplomacy. And the how of diplomacy is changing. I think we'll see a decline in the big set-piece summit and conference. I hope we'll see a decline in the diplomatic language, the platitudes that we use. My country feels grave concern about this, and we will build our warm bilateral relationship with country Y. That sort of language that surrounds diplomacy just doesn't work in the internet age. It doesn't feel authentic. It turns people off. It disconnects them from what we're actually doing. And so we lose ground unless we find a better way of communicating with people. I think we'll lose much of the elitism of diplomacy. It's harder when you have a Twitter handle and a Facebook page to carry on prancing around calling yourself Your Excellency and so on. We need to reduce the barriers between diplomats and the public that they serve, and serve is the right word. We'll have less structure. Traditionally, diplomacy has been like a British banquet. Everyone knows what's on the menu, where you sit, what the cutlery is, what order you eat the courses. Now diplomacy is becoming much more like a Lebanese meal. It's food spread out over the table, everyone is piling in. More cut and thrust. We're going to have to get used to losing control. We're going to have to find our inner anarchists, which is not a very comfortable place for people used to the traditional world of diplomacy. So all that is going to change. And we are also going to have to find a way to use these new digital tools to refashion the international architecture. 200 years ago, Congress of Vienna, the European leaders came together and reshaped the map of Europe. And it was the diplomats that did that. I can't see a similar conference or summit working out the future of the UN, the future of the Bretton Woods institutions in the digital age. We're going to have to find something much, much more inclusive, but that is complicated. Who has the convening power to call that conference? Who chooses who takes part and who doesn't? Who has a voice and who doesn't? But one thing's for certain, it cannot be a bunch of elites, diplomatic elites, leaders in a smoke-filled room anymore. It just won't stand up to scrutiny in the digital age. Overall, as I look forward, I'm actually still quite confident. I'm still an optimist. People said to me that Lebanon would be the graveyard for my idealism. Actually, it was quite the opposite, despite the fact that we lived through some pretty grim times. I do think the statistics are on our side. I do think we have a history as humans of finding the creativity we need to come through these moments of peril. I think resilience is very much in our DNA, in our diplomatic DNA, but our DNA as humans. The connectivity, I'm convinced, will be a great leveller. I think got carried away early in Lebanon in saying, the most powerful weapon in the Middle East was the smartphone, not the nuclear weapon of Iran or the chemical weapons of Assad. There was that wave of excitement around the Arab Spring and what connectivity would do for the region. It hasn't been as fast or as positive as we hoped then, but I still think the smartphone is going to be, over the medium to longer term, the most powerful weapon in the Middle East. But the connectivity also has a fantastic impact on inequality too. Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg says that for every 10 people you get online, one is lifted out of poverty. I think it's higher than that, but that lies ahead of us to test. So, diplomacy has to adjust, but it has ridden change in the past. Famously, someone said, when the fax came along, they said, you can replace the Foreign Office with a fax. Well, the Foreign Office is still there, it's still standing, the fax machine, barely. When the telephone was invented, the then Foreign Secretary said, this infernal instrument will be the death of diplomacy. Well, the telephone, the landline, is almost dead, and diplomacy is still standing. So diplomats have to find ways to use social media, use digital technology, rather than just be disrupted by it. We can't have a situation where people are saying, you can replace the Foreign Office with Wikipedia, because Wikipedia knows more information. You can replace your diplomats with Skype, because you can speak directly to leaders in other countries. Diplomats have to be very savvy about using this new technology. Diplomats also, like any industry that wants to survive these waves of disruption, they have to hold on to where they add most value. They have to find the things that the robots won't be able to do. And for me, those are creativity, tact, curiosity about the world, and above all, a strong dose of courage. All of those things were diplomatic qualities before the internet, and they will be diplomatic qualities after the internet. So 3 quick ways I think that the ambassador, the envoy in 2020 will be different. 1, they will do much more crossover. They will do much more multitasking. They won't be on a single diplomatic track. They will be learning lobbying from the best lobbyists, learning business from the best business people, learning marketing and communication from the best marketers and communicators. And they will be more porous. People will be moving in and out of these professions much more than they have done in the past. Secondly, they will either be digital or they will be dead, basically. 5 years ago, there were 4 of us, 4 ambassadors on Twitter. Now it's more than half. 5 years' time, I very much doubt that there will be any ambassadors who aren't on Twitter or whatever the successor of Twitter will be. You simply cannot survive anymore, I don't believe, in a profession that relies on information gathering and influence unless you are using these new tools. And I don't just mean social media. I also mean the new tools we'll be able to access around sentiment mining, for example. Traditionally, diplomats sent their reports on the basis of 2 gin and tonics and the editorial page. Now they will be able to mine information on a much more comprehensive level. They will also have to be using these new digital tools to get much better at service delivery. When you go to Amazon to buy a product, you expect a very fast, personalized, intuitive service. You're not going to accept government services for, say, a visa that take weeks and weeks and weeks and tie you up in bureaucracy. So we will have to adjust fast to those expectations. And thirdly, the envoy, the ambassador in 2020, will be much more focused on connectivity. They will know that's where they add value. only connect, making those real connections with people that social media, digital media will allow us to make. We'll get out of from behind our desks. I'm just doing a review of the Foreign Office, and one of the things we'll say is we'll abolish the phrase desk officer. We don't want our people behind their desks. We want them out there engaging. We'll start to think of an embassy not as a building, bricks and mortar, but as an idea, as a launch pad, as a hub for the national brand. I always say to ambassadors very reluctant to come into this space, they have to imagine it as like a huge diplomatic reception where all their contacts are mingling and interacting and engaging and exchanging information. You wouldn't stand outside looking in and saying nothing. You wouldn't turn up and just transmit, just shout your statements from one corner of the room. You wouldn't delegate it to someone else. You'd be in there yourself, in the arguments, having the conversations, engaging people. And that's what social media gives us now, this a huge, great diplomatic reception. And there will be crazy people out there, there'll be very rude people out there. I encounter a lot of them on my Twitter handle. But there's no other way to engage people on such a massive, massive scale. And I can talk a bit in the Q&A about some of the ways that we tried to actually use this technology to break down arguments and achieve diplomatic objectives in different ways. So the DNA of my business, like everyone's business, is changing fast. But I would argue diplomacy in its raw form, going right back to UGG, matters too much to all of your businesses to be simply put out of business altogether. And I believe that the next generation of sort of digital native diplomats, it's the best time to be a diplomat. They will have more opportunity to not just understand the world, but to influence the world around them. And so I would always say that diplomats should be the pioneers of this new terrain. They shouldn't be simply following the rest of the crowd. They should be right out there in front, pushing the boundaries of what we can do with this new technology. But all of this is too important just to leave to diplomats. If diplomacy didn't exist, we would have to invent it. But it can no longer just be done by a small group of diplomats in a corner like some kind of cult. It needs to be a much, much more open, engaging, inclusive craft if it is going to come up with the answers that we need to get us through all of this change, which people like you are going to be generating for the world. That's all I have, but I'd love to get into a conversation about some of the, wherever you'd like to take it.